Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're all energized and ready for the first panel session of the day, titled Rethinking Relations Between State and Education. The relationship between the state and our education systems is an important one. It has a profound impact on individuals that play an important role in our society, both during their time in school and beyond. Moderating our panel today is Professor Dr. Ibrahim Hakan Karataş. He's part of the Educational Administration and Istanbul Medeniyet University. Joining Professor Karataş is Professor of Education Policy, International Studies in Education at Michigan State University, Amita Chudgar, former Minister of Education and Training, Kingdom of Lesotho, Her Excellency Dr. Mampono Haketla, and the president of the Albanian Academy of Arts and Sciences at the University of New York, Tirana, Professor Dr. Fatos Tarifa. The floor is yours, Professor Karataş.
Thank you, Efnan. As you said, just after Professor Richard Falk's keynote, it would be a very well-based panel held today. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night for everyone from all over the globe, because it's really an international summit, and we have very different participants from all over the world. So I am welcoming to all participants and audience to our panel. This is a part of fourth Istanbul Education Summit organized by Turkish Maarif Foundation. This summit is really a key platform for exchanging ideas and practices in education, bringing together academics, policymakers, and educators worldwide. This year's theme is Education for a Fair and Equitable Society for a Sustainable Future, highlighting education's role in achieving global equity and societal transformations. Now, let's focus on our panel topic. It's rethinking relations between state and education. We will discuss how the state's role in education must adapt to meet the needs of a rapidly changing world. Historically, the states has controlled education through centralized policies. However, as societies become more diverse and technologically advanced, we need to rethink the relationship. So I need help. I think the audience can see my presentation now, because I also want to share the main topic and the main discussion question of this panel. Actually, our esteemed speakers know about the topic and the questions today we will focus on, but also I need to share, I need to show the audience today's topic and the questions. I think it is shared right. I'm sorry. Okay. I think it would be here. Okay, now I succeed to share my screen, I think. Today's topic is policy and governments. The role of the states and government in education to provide equity, fair education services to all people, because we have a really very challenging world in this today. And the questions here just want to share for the audience because my speakers know what we discussed today. But just if you see the questions, maybe you can focus well to our discussion today. But please just let me share some theoretical framework for this discussion, because our speakers from Africa to US, from Balkans, we will listen very special examples or the implementations of the policies and related topics about relation between states and education. But it should be better to see the framework of state education relations. Actually, in my short brief, I think it will take only 3 minutes. In my short research, I see the 9 different stages we have in relation between state and education. As you see, in the agrarian era and modernization era, industrialization revolution era, actually we have very weak or almost non-existent relations between state and education. But in the second group, nation state era or welfare state period or the post-World War II development era, we have very directly and strong relations between state and education. But because the topic and the focus is today for our discussion today, we should focus mostly neoliberal era, knowledge society era, and especially the most current era, post-COVID and the AI era. In this period, we have very ambitious, mixed, shared, ambitious, imperative, sophisticated, and interconnected relation between state and education. But there are some limitations in this grouping or classifying the relationship between state and education, because when we look at this classification, mostly we see a Eurocentric timelines, but actually there are very different experiences all over the globe. So we should open our minds and perspectives to understand how, for example, Africa or socialist countries or Eastern Europe or the Muslim world lives these kind of relations and how kind of experiences they witness during this term. And the second important limitations for this classification is state education dynamics, because it is driven mostly by nation building, economic goals, and cultural diplomacy, influenced by global institutions like the UN and the World Bank or EU or other regional organizations all over the world. And my other presentation, I have only just opened the minds, will share some priority principles of relations between state and education. Because what we are looking for from this relation, what we expect from this relation, the most important thing is managing uncertainty and adaptability. And the second one, bridging the digital divides and having some implementation or intervention to solve and to manage this situation, and leveraging research and evidence and quality education and continuous improvement. And in this period, my last share about this topic is the priorities of relations. As you see, the Web3, metaverse, and blockchain dominates all aspects of lives, including education and educational policy. And migration is also another important topics of this process and the current times. And the financing education is getting more difficult and tough for all countries, because more people, more young people ask to access to the education all over the world, and the uncertainty mostly challenging the future of education. So these all are topics today I want to share with you, and I will now share my table with my esteemed speakers. As Efnan introduced, we have Dr. Amita Chudgar today here from Michigan State University. She's from US, but engaged deeply to Africa and India, right, Chudgar? So you have very broad idea about the policies globally. And Dr. Fatos Tarifa, as a politician, as an academic, and as a sociologist, I think very clearly witnessing and watching what's happening all over the world, and also very important that of the globe, Europe and the Balkan. So we will listen your ideas as well. And Dr. Mamfono Katila, Her Excellency from Kingdom of Lesotho, she is a mathematician, she is a teacher, and she is an academic, and also a very valuable politician in her country, and is a former Minister of Education. So if you allow me, please let me give the first floor first to the Dr. Her Excellency Mamfono Katila, because it will be better to see different aspects of the world from Africa. A vision, it would be very insightful for this discussion. As I said, we have only 2 or 12 minutes, Dr. Mamfono. We will have 2 times, 20, in total 24 minutes for our presentations. Please use your first 10 minutes or 12 minutes, and the floor is yours, and we will very excited to listen your presentations, to your ideas, Dr. Mamfono.
Thank you so much. My name is Mamfono Hagedla. As you mentioned, I'm from the Kingdom of Lesotho, and I must say I'm very glad to have been invited to be part of this panel. Today, I'm going to share insights into the intricate relationship between the state and education in Lesotho. And I understand we have over 20,000 participants, and some of them are wondering, where is Lesotho and what is Lesotho? Lesotho is a country in Southern Africa, surrounded by South Africa, but not part of South Africa. It's an independent state. It has a population of 2.1 million people, and we always boast that we have the highest, lowest elevation in the whole world, because the whole country is above 1,000 meters above sea level. So, and it's the only country in Africa that has a ski resort. So not all of Africa is hot. We are in summer now, but in winter, if you come to Lesotho, I'll gladly take you to the ski resort. Now, enough about my plug on tourism. As the moderator indicated, I have been a mathematics teacher, lecturer, and ended up as a politician, as a Minister of Education, amongst the many portfolios. The education system is very unique in that it has historical basis, that schools in Lesotho were started by the missionaries. When the first French missionaries came to Lesotho in 1833, they found people, they were already civilized, but they did not read and write. So the first schools really were set up to teach people how to read the Bible and how to interpret for the priests. So there has always been that relationship between the state and churches, because the state in Lesotho, or government, sets the curriculum. Everybody, regardless of the school they go to, follows the same curriculum. They write the same examination. Although the schools are not owned by government, out of 100%, 86% of the schools are church-owned. Roman Catholic Church, Evangelical Church, Anglican Church. Government only owns 11% of the schools in Lesotho, but government dictates, because it sets the parameters of what can be taught and when and how. And you can see that dynamic because the churches have their own interests. They want their children to be taught religious education, moral education, and so on. So there's that thin line that has to be crossed by the churches and government. Because the churches were struggling, government decided to pay all the teachers in the schools. We made education in the primary school or elementary school free from 2000. So children should have access to school regardless of their family background. So we have free primary education where children get their books, they are fed at least 1 meal a day. And I must say Lesotho is, according to the World Bank, a lower middle income country. So we have a lot of pockets of poverty, especially in the rural areas. So the government has taken over the running of schools, even though the schools do not belong to them. So it pays the teachers, it sets the curriculum, it sets the tests, it builds the schools, the infrastructure from scratch or repair that has been damaged. So ownership belongs to the churches, and ownership belongs to government to a very less extent. Like I said, it's 86% churches and maybe just 11, 12%. Now, the latest development is that there are now private schools coming in. And those private schools still adhere to the government curricula, but they have added things like, let's teach our children coding, artificial intelligence, computer, and so on. Unfortunately, now those private schools charge fees, meaning that you leave those children who are not able to afford the fees vulnerable because they will not have access to this fourth industrial area. So that, as I mentioned, the state has a very critical role in the establishment of or the running of schools. There was a question in the questions that we were given about decentralization. And I can understand that for countries that are huge. If you take, for example, the US with 51 states, each state could have its own rules about education. But for a small country like Lesotho, with a population of 2 million, it doesn't make sense to say you are decentralizing education. What you have to do is to standardize, to make sure whether you are in Maseru, which is the capital, or you are in the rural area, you get the same level of education. So in terms of decentralization, we in Lesotho are not there yet. And it could be possible in other jurisdictions. The relationship or the challenges in the state-church collaboration. Because the states provide the resources, the autonomy of the church schools can complicate oversight because the schools or the churches still run, they select their boards, they select their teachers. So there might be a little bit of conflict. But otherwise, in my experience as a lecturer, and my experience as a Minister of Education, the relationship between the state and the churches, who are the owners of the school, is very cordial. So now let's talk about opportunities for strengthening the relationship. First, there's regular policy dialogue among the state, the churches, and the private sector, because we are always saying we have a lot of children who complete our schools, but they are unemployed. Why? Because what they are being taught in schools does not resonate with the private sector. So what we are saying is that there has to be a policy dialogue between the state, the churches, and the private sector. The private sector says we need engineers. So we should be teaching subjects in our schools that will enable our children to become engineers. So policy dialogue is very important between the three parties, the private sector, the church owners, and state. The second one is investing in capacity building. I mentioned earlier on that the government or the state pays literally everything for the schools, but we need to have capacity building, enough teachers. For example, in Lesotho, we have only one teacher training college. We have a university and a few other institutions. So we need to expand that and also look at the financing models. We have to talk about the public-private partnership, because if the private sector says we need people who are water engineers, for example, Lesotho is abundant with water, but we don't have people who can deal with that. So they should be able to join government to finance the new curriculum that we are talking about. So I'm looking at my time. I do not want to take too much time, but I think one of the things that I would like to emphasize is that for Lesotho, the relationship between state, church, schools has been going on for almost 200 years, and it has we have maneuvered, we have survived, and I don't think there is at this point any reason to change the status quo. All we need to do is to strengthen this by having more dialogue between government, between the schools, and the private sector. I'm not excluding the parents, because the parents also play a very critical role in this. So I'd like to conclude by just saying that the relationship between state and education in Lesotho, as an example, is complex, but also interdependent. One cannot divorce the other ones. So we have to work together to create a robust education system that meets all the needs of the Basotho. You mentioned earlier about issues of culture. Is our education protecting our culture? Issues of religion. Is the education system allowing the churches to practice their religion? So we are having a balancing act, and I think we are still on track. Thank you very much. I would like to close by saying thank you again for the opportunity to share these perspectives, and I look forward to listening to the other colleagues on this panel, and maybe I'll come back in the second round. Thank you, Sam.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mafono. We get an idea about the actors of Kingdom of Lesotho in education and the relation between state and education. So we will come back to you, and we will move to Dr. Anita Chudgar from US, from Michigan State University, because I believe you will connect the experiences in US, in India, and Africa as well in your academic legacy. So please let us listen first, second turn you, then we will move to Dr. Fatos.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. Good day, colleagues and listeners from all over. Greetings from the state of Michigan in the United States, where I'm a professor of education policy and also the interim associate dean for international studies in our College of Education. I welcome you all to the panel. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I want to thank the organizers of the Istanbul Education Summit for inviting me. My sincere gratitude to all of you, to the organizers who are working very hard in the backgrounds, who we don't get to see, but who have made this panel possible. So it's my great pleasure and honor to be with you today. And I know that this panel provides us an opportunity to have a wide, rich global discussion, and I very much look forward to that with my esteemed panelists. I hope we will have a fruitful discussion on some of these important questions. So the theme of our panel is rethinking relations between state and education. And I will respond to this theme by also leaning into the overall theme of the conference, which is education for fair and equitable society for a sustainable future. As we have already heard from Dr. Ibrahim, Dr. Mamfono, the minister, we are in an ambiguous, complex time of interdependence, and where the role of education, the role of state in our society is shifting rapidly. So this panel is very timely. To structure my remarks, I want to offer three observations at the outset. To first situate the education in the relationship between education and state, if we think in the terms of economics, in economics, we often think of goods or commodities which are considered public goods or private goods. There are different ways in which we classify. But the idea is that if something is thought of as a public good, then we have an argument for the state to play a particular role in the provision of such a good. So, for example, street lights, clean air, these are very good examples where we would say the state does have a role to play in provision of those things to the society. And most would agree that education is also a public good where the state indeed has a role to play, just as we were hearing from the Kingdom of Lesotho just a few minutes ago. Whereas some things are private goods, for example, our clothing, our vehicles, our phones, these are private commodities, and we don't necessarily make an argument for the state to make provision of all of these for all the citizens. So if we think about education as a public good, there is not necessarily a debate that education, the state, the government has a role to play in education, but there are very robust debates in the literature in education across the world in terms of the kinds of role, the extent of the role, the nature of the role states should play in the provision of education. With that in mind, let me present three ways we might think about some of these challenges and debates. And each of these have already been echoed in the remarks of my colleagues who have preceded me. One way to think about the role of state is to think about different levels of education. So, for instance, what is the role of the state in ensuring that all the citizens have basic literacy and numeracy, that all citizens are able to essentially read and write, at least in one language, in the national language, and have basic numeracy knowledge? One might argue that the state has a very important role to play at that level of education. What about higher education? What is the argument for the role of the state for higher education? It's an entirely different question. For instance, the World Bank many years ago, now this research is dated, argued that higher education brings much more benefit to the private individual. So if I have higher education, it brings me more benefit than it brings my society. So what is the argument for states' involvement there? Perhaps state involvement should be lower, but is that the only way to think about it? What about nations that are seeking to grow their scientists, their engineers? What is the role of the state in higher education? What about early childhood education? This is yet another area of education where we might think about the role of the state in different ways. There is extensive research that has shown that investing in children's learning early, by which I mean at the kindergarten stage and before kindergarten stage, early learning is extremely valuable to ensure that our children are set up to be successful through their future education journeys. So what is the role of state investment in the case of early childhood education? We also know that provision of good early education for children might make it more feasible for women to join the labor force more easily and contribute to the economy. So I present these ideas and questions to lay out how, in terms of thinking about levels of education, basic literacy and numeracy, higher education, early learning, we can see how there are different ways to argue about the importance of the state and the role that state may or may not play in this context. Now let me present a different perspective, which is also something that we have heard in the preceding comments, which is to think about the role of the state, not in terms of the levels of education, but in terms of the finance. Finance is crucial, and we have already heard some of the comments preceding that very much speak to this. So what should be the level of financial commitment that the state or the government makes in supporting national education systems? And as you can see, I'm asking questions, I'm not necessarily answering them. And the reason I ask these questions is because I think these are the questions that are compelling, that demand our attention. And I don't think there is one simple answer that, we have to be aware of the context. As again, I was very struck by the presentation from the minister in terms of the unique context of Lesotho, where certain things might be appropriate and certain other things may not be appropriate for the national context. So what should be the role of the state in education finance? What should be left to the private funds? What should be left to the parents? What about private entities? What about international foundations, international donors? As we know, in many countries, global non-governmental organization, bilateral actors play a very significant role in funding and supporting financially the education systems. What are the roles of these entities? These are very intense debates. In the United States, and Dr. Ibrahim mentioned, my expertise actually are not in the United States. My expertise are in other countries all over the world. But even in the US, there are fierce debates. For example, you might have heard of questions of school vouchers. So where there are proponents who say the government should provide school vouchers to parents so that they can send their children to any school of their choice. People who are against the idea would say, no, this is not a good idea. The government money should not be spent like this because it can lead to some inequities in the distribution of education. In the broader global context, the Global Education Monitoring Report, the GEM report that many of you might be aware of that UNESCO puts out every year, calculates that in order to achieve the 2030 target for universal basic education, which means that we would have pre-primary education, primary education, and secondary education in low and lower middle income countries. So these are countries that, according to the World Bank, have a certain level of income, less than a certain level of income. We will need to spend 461 billion US dollars annually. We are looking at 461 billion US dollars every year between now and 2030. This is a huge amount of money, and it makes it very clear that governments, states will indeed have a role to play. In fact, the Education 2030 Framework for Action has set key financial benchmarks for the amount of contribution governments are expected to make to their education systems as a portion of their gross domestic product or their public expenditure on education. I share all of this to say that we can see that there has been a strong and steady argument for state to make financial contributions towards education systems. But here is an interesting sort of twist to that data as well. So while state is a significant contributor to financial health of a national education system, data shows that households, the minister mentioned the parents, indeed, the parents actually pick up a very significant portion of the educational expenditure in countries across the world. So in an average, in a median country, parents pick up about 25% of the overall education expenditure. And what is very interesting and compelling is that, in fact, in the lower middle income countries, so in the countries which have less resources, parents spend about 45% of the overall education expenditure. In rich countries, parent contribution is 20%. So what this is telling us is that, in fact, in richer countries, such as the one I'm located in right now in the United States, the state is indeed funding a larger portion of education expenditure than it is often able to in lower income countries. So this is a very striking statistic that, in fact, the state is overall spending more money in richer countries. And these are data from the recent UNESCO reports. So again, in the realm of finance, we can see that there is a complex question here about the role of the state, which is indeed essential, but one has to think through the nuances in terms of the extent of financial contribution the state makes and the implications of that. And I will make one final observation before I stop, which is to think about the role of the state not in terms of the level of education, like I was mentioning, literacy, numeracy, early childhood, higher education, not in terms of finance, but in terms of policies and regulations. That is yet another important way in which the state comes in and plays a role within our education system. We often see, again, I'm going back to the remarks from Lesotho, that state may not play a financial role. It may do that, but it might often play a very important regulatory role. It might often regulate, it might often set policies and guidelines. And this is a complex question as well, because there is, again, a balance here. It is possible that the policies can be so rigid, so centralized that they might stifle innovation, they might stifle new ideas. Or it is possible that policies might be such that they might allow state to promote certain ideas and maybe curb certain other ideas, which might be aligning with the preference of the state. But at the same time, is it wise to say that we don't want state policies and state regulations? Because indeed, state does play a very important role as a regulator of quality when we want to ensure that all of our children do have access to quality education. So here I'm reminded, of some of the work that I have done, we have heard about education systems across the world where teacher capacity development is a very important concern. And often, where there is a need, there is a great surge of private teacher training colleges across the world. And I'm thinking of specific countries, but I don't have to necessarily name names of countries where there might be a big surge in private education, teacher education training institutes, which is very good because teacher training is needed. But then if there is no check on regulation, no check on quality, which is an important role the state plays, we again have this problem of the balance between the importance of state as a regulator in terms of policies and regulations, where it can play a good role, but it can also be overbearing. So I will stop my remarks here. I really appreciate this opportunity. And just to summarize, as we can see, the question of the role the state plays is indeed very complex. And I have laid it out in 3 different perspectives. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. And I know I haven't answered any of my own questions, but I hope we will discuss them together. Thank you.
Dr. Anita, actually, nobody have exact answers for all questions, but really the differences role in terms of level of education and financing education and regulating is actually very interconnected with the international organization. Actually, in Turkey, we have a very recent example because we are in the way of full membership of European Union. So we always also take into consideration the rules of regulations of European Union. And also the same Uganda, for example, they have an Eastern African communities, and they are closing to close each other. The education systems, they always follows their regulations, and they make a lot of meetings during that time. Last things about your insightful speech. In Uganda, for example, because I am here, a very fresh experiences here I have, most of the schools, even primary schools, even kindergartens and secondary schools, I'm not talking about higher education, most of them are tuition fee they ask for from students because governments cannot afford enough finance to the schools. The universities, I think only the salaries paid, the state's universities salaries paid by the governments, but the other all cost held by households or the students by themselves. Thank you very much. And let's move very special part of the world, Balkans, because the multiculturalism and the interesting relations happens in the Balkans, and also education. For example, I visited Macedonia, Albania, and Serbia and Bosnia, and they have, for example, different languages in even same school. And the governments regulate these relations. It's very exciting relationship between state and education. The floor is yours, Dr.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be part of this panel. I enjoyed the discussion so far by the previous 2 colleagues and your moderation as well. I come from a special country. Why do I say that? When I studied at the University of Tirana before the 90s, I always thought and believed that I was never going to leave the country. So the entire world was the size of Albania because we're living in a communist rule state where nobody could get out and nobody could come in. So everything changed then with those, what we call the post-communist revolutions, and I was given a chance to study again in the United States in a good school like the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I graduated, got a PhD in sociology, a discipline that was previously considered the bourgeois science in Albania. But anyway, so I speak as a scholar, not as a politician, as you introduced me. I was a diplomat for a number of years, serving as ambassador in the United States and the Netherlands, unless you consider diplomacy politics by other means. But academia has been my lifelong profession for over 40 years now, as teaching at several universities, including one in Michigan, like Eastern Michigan University, and the Netherlands. But I also come from two different societies. So this is probably, if I may call it a privilege, from a sociological point of view. I lived under communist rule, a dictatorship, and now in democracy. We're trying to build democracy here. So the perspectives are different. Plus, the university where I teach now, the University of New York, Tirana, is the only private university in Tirana where English is the language of instruction. So there is a lot of international experience here. International staff, international students, international programs, a double program of the State University of New York. We have also connection with Turkey, a joint doctoral program. But let me start with the topic that we're going to discuss today. It is interesting to see that we talk about an issue like that state and education relationship that is at least 2,500 years old. And I said that because it was Plato in his Republic where first asked the question, is the education of citizens a private matter, or is it a matter primarily a concern for the state? And we know all that Plato very much emphasized the role that states should play in educating its own citizens. In his ideal states, citizens should have an ideal education. Only that way they may create an ideal state. He also saw the training of students and children as traineeship for leadership, citizenship and leadership. His ideas were, as we know, and I will be very brief in this historical overview, very, very important and influenced a number of philosophers we know, beginning with Montaigne and Hobbes and Spinoza and Rousseau, John Dewey in the States, and John Stuart Mill, Nietzsche, and what have you. But it suffices to recall that Rousseau, especially, is remembered to have said that if you would like to have an idea of what is public education, just read, the Republic by Plato. It is not a work of politics, he said, but it's the finest work on education that has been ever written. So their ideas still are challenging in today's world, which is a very different world indeed. And it became so by the early 19th century, then the entire 19th century. By the middle of that century, we have Herbert Spencer, who said that now, today, it is widely accepted that the role of the state is important in the development of education at any society. But let me come to the point, indeed. There is no denying, indeed, that education is fundamental to the economic and social development, growth, and well-being of every society. It delivers, and this was what was discussed here, large returns in terms of nation's wealth, as well as the wealth of individuals and families. In our days, knowledge, as we all know, and education are typically viewed as synonymously with formal schooling. Over the 20th century, state-provided schooling became a norm in old industrialized world. In recent time, in the US, for example, 85 to 90% of children are educated in schools that are publicly financed and run. But several questions, important questions, demand answers. What power should the state have on education? Or how much say does or should a government have over schools? How much government control on what is taught inside kindergartens through the 12K education? Do or should higher education institutions have greater freedom and autonomy? when it comes to their curricula. I'll skip this part because it has to do with the concept of the academic freedom that is baked into the policy statement of every university. But there are profound questions that need answers today, and the answers to these questions are neither easy nor do they rest in one's point of view. The answer to this question vary, but one thing is certain. Education is particularly important, not only to individuals, it's important for every society indeed. That is why education is mentioned in the constitution of every state. And this is the context in which we're talking today. So let us not forget, everywhere education is, for the most part, financed by the state, by central and local governments, through legislative and policy decision-making processes. In fact, education is the largest item in public expenditure in almost every developed country today throughout the world. This fact alone justifies the government's role and authority to appoint people to executive branches, positions, although many times they have to be approved by legislatures. Government may also nominate people to serve on state boards and commissions, which can influence education. I assume we all agree that education is too important to be left to teachers or schools alone. It is the responsibility that falls on the shoulders of many actors: parents, teachers, education experts, education boards and state agencies, legislatures, and the government itself, of course. There is no country that I know of in which the state has surrendered its educational duties and responsibilities to teachers, to experts, or to institutions themselves. Government have always been responsible for the oversee actually the K-2 education system to ensure universal access and affordability for all. Despite the diverse options available to families in various countries, such as private school, homeschooling, and charter schools, traditional public schools continue to serve most of the populations almost everywhere. The logical consequence of this premise is that states must continue to support and transform the K-12 system to meet the demands of a very rapidly changing world. But how? That's the basic question. There are a number of ways in which government can help education and even take the lead in reforming the system. Besides tracking education statistics, for example, or using a complex system of funding mechanisms by states and local tax revenues, and policy directives focusing on non-discrimination and accessibility, quality education, fostering opportunity for all, governments also have soft but considerable powers to shape what, how, and where students learn, strengthen the education system across early childhood education, which was mentioned here rightfully, K-2 education, higher education, and workforce development, which is very important in today's world. It all boils down to increase states' investments to build upon the benefits and values of the public education system, while addressing the challenges education systems facing today, students also, families, and educators in this 21st century. We should not forget we're almost a quarter of a century now, a new century, and we're still discussing about important issues that will be more important even in the future. So the challenges are numerous and varied from the K-12 education to postgraduate education. They required policymakers, education experts, and teachers to think and find innovation ways of how students at all levels can thrive to this digital age that has changed and is changing with each passing day. The traditional ways teachers teach, students learn, along with the meaning of education itself. I will speak a little bit later and focus on a few challenges pertaining to the profound effect of the internet and artificial intelligence on education today and in the near future, a future that, as an AI-driven world, it becoming ever more difficult to predict. In our days, the traditional functions of schools and universities, as we all know, as agents of knowledge dissemination and socialization, are largely affected and seriously undermined, indeed, by the internet and the modern information and communication technologies. The internet has become an integral part of almost everybody's life, a place in which people work, play, communicate, and learn, to a point that the boundaries separating now our physical life from our digital ones, are becoming almost invisible. The latest information technologies and communication technologies are intensely challenging the system of education at all levels. From the kindergarten, I am a grandfather, and I can testify that it has become urgently necessary that these methods are thoroughly adjusted and transformed due to the numerous new possibilities and resources of information and informal learning that are now available in a new learning ecology and almost for everyone. So today, generations of students, Gen Z and Gen Alpha, are vastly different from all previous generations. They are no longer the students our education system were designed to teach. Today's students have not just changed their slang and clothes and hairstyle and body adornment. They have changed almost everything. In fact, a really big discontinuity has taken place, changing things to so fundamentally that there's no way back anymore. Then due to sheer amount of information provided by the internet and the interaction with today's students think and process the information in ways that are very different from the way we, their parents or grandparents, are used to, or without generations. And let me conclude with one remark. Unfortunately, most of us, the adult generation and educators, continue to ignore or refuse to accept this new reality. Let us accept it. Many of us are actually unable to cope with it. The facts are persistent and most consequential. Today's students are a generation that has grown up with this, internet and digital technology. They are net screeners.
Yes.
They are raised in a technologically interconnected world and social environment, which is largely in the infosphere, a world in which the boundaries of work, home, entertainment have all fallen. And if they seek information, they are practical and driven by the quick results found on the web, and which the school does not provide, or the Google or Wikipedia or ChatGPT. And these are becoming the source of information. So let's not be mistaken again, and I'll conclude with these words. We're living not only in a world that is changing so fast and in uncertain ways, we're also living in very turbulent times. The sooner we understand and accept these new realities, the better. For as Peter Drucker has pointed out, the greatest dangers in times of turbulence is not the turbulence. It is the temptation to deny a reality. And we're living this reality. I'll continue later with my other points.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Fatos. Actually, we use time good, but not as good as we wait. So we will shorten our next turn speech to 9 or 8 minutes. But just before that, really, I agree with you. And I think the most important problem is the deeply changing shape of the education or the generation's understanding of life. So I think the main problem between the state and the education is the politicians is a bit unseasoned or get older, and it is difficult for them to understand what's happening in the schools, in the classrooms between children and young people. Sure. So I think this is one of the main challenge for the policy and the relation between state and education. If you let me, I will share what is happening in Turkey about education and what is the relation experiencing in Turkey. So let me share just one slide. Then I will let you go on, Your Honor, Excellency, Dr. Mofana, to listen your insightful ideas about the Lesotho. Because I need also manage my screen, and I think I succeed, and my friends can share my slide on the screen. Okay. In Turkey, actually, we have 12 topics in last 2 decades. Mostly the states engaging in education. The one and most important topic in Turkey was, it's not as much as in the earlier time of these 2 decades, but the efforts toward liberalization and democratization. It's kind of inner problem, but also it's a general political problem in all over the world. Investment in expansion and equity, we made a lot of investment in education in the last 2 decades, and mostly the government resources used for those. And curriculum reform and constructive approach also implemented in last 2 decades. Digitalization and ICT integration is very important aspect of our relations in Turkey, and almost all schools have internet, broadband internet, and necessary tools in the schools. Enhancing teacher quality, as Dr. Amita mentioned, and alignment with EU and OECD standards, the PISA result, TIMSS result, always, and very big discussion in Turkey, as also always we are getting position according to the results of those examinations and reports. And investments in development and growth, actually, by investing in the technoparks, in the innovative or research and development centers. Privatization and diversification is also very important policy in Turkey. And as Dr. Amita mentioned, as in USA, our governments also try to share some resources with the private schools by paying to the parents directly. And emphasis on religious values and cultural identity. It's also a very important topic in Turkey. And massification and internationalization of higher education is the very most important current agenda in Turkey in the last 2 decades. Research, innovation, and technological collaboration is also on the agenda. And the strengthening and expanding vocational education to assist the economy and to foster the development and growth in economy. So these are the topics of Turkey in last 2 decades, and we are continue to discuss on those topics. And now I will leave the floor to Your Honorable Dr. Mofana, and it's just a directing question. What are the specific problems and your own solutions in Lesotho? Mostly it's not discussed in developed countries or other side of the world. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, moderator. I'm really surprised that we are all speaking from different perspectives, but there's a common denominator, that it is very difficult to separate state from education. So it is a question of levels. At what point and how far are we allowing this to happen? The issues that you just raised about Turkey, you can just remove Turkey there and put Lesotho, and I'll say, yes, this is the same of the problems we have. I think we are now shifting from purely academic education to vocational education because of the needs, like we said, of the market. So the market dictates what has to be taught. Because if we continue teaching people reading, writing, arithmetic, and ending there, we'll just have a lot of graduates, but people who cannot actually do work. So I just thought I would mention that that from where I am, I can see that we are all the same, regardless of where we are. And my passion in teacher education, I could see your comment there about the quality of teaching, is that we have to train our teachers, because what was taught 20 years ago when I was a teacher trainer has changed now to meet the demands of the new needs of the country. The gentleman from Albania was talking about how his grandchildren are so now tech savvy, right? And for us, it used to be paper and pencil, but now you can just actually live off your cell phone. So I'm just saying I'm amazed or marveled at the fact that we are all the same despite of where we are. That's my take on your comment. I'll come in if other people have questions also. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Mofana. And let's move again, Dr. Anita, and to connect ideas. And if you have more to share, it's your turn, please.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to. This was such a rich, it is such a rich panel, and thank you, Dr. Fotosh, as well, for your comments, so valuable. I could not agree more with Dr. Mamfona that we seem to all be in agreement about the important role of state, and I think the question is about the levels, about the nature of involvement and what that might mean, depending on the context. So that, I mean, it seems to rise very clearly to the surface. I thought maybe I will bring in 2 or 3 other considerations just for our collective thinking, and maybe other speakers or Dr. Ibrahim, you might have some ideas on these as well. So one of the things, while we are in agreement about the important role of state and the government, we would be remiss if we don't recognize that there is actually a growth and a surge in private provision of education across the world. And I know this more clearly in some countries and contexts which I'm more familiar with, but my sense is this is a general trend. And what we see happening is, this idea of parents seeking specific kinds of experiences, or often what is called voting with voting with your feet. You want to try, go to a system which you consider to be perhaps different or better. Like we heard from Lesotho, the private educators are able to provide certain experiences that the government is not yet providing. But that growth is inevitably leading to some important considerations in terms of who is then able to access private education and the inequalities that it creates, because more likely than not, private education will require, and I was struck by the example from Uganda that you mentioned, Dr. Ibrahim, where parents are required to pay, because we know that that is a big barrier to so many of the parents and children across the world. So what are the implications of that? There is also the questions about regulations and oversight. There are different ideas and models and variations in terms of what kinds of regulations might private schools experience in terms of the curriculum they teach. Perhaps that might be regulated centrally, but I have seen interesting variations in their practices to hire teachers. So we know that in education systems, one of the largest expenses is teacher salaries. And private schools often can have very different teacher hiring practices than government schools. Government teachers are often civil servants, and they have different working conditions. So the growth of the private sector, which is undeniable for a range of different reasons, I think raises some really important questions for a panel such as ours, where we are trying to understand the role of the state with education. As state perhaps is pulling back in some ways if the private sector is coming in, its role is growing perhaps as the regulator, moderator, quality controller. And where is the balance here, I think, is an important and interesting question in my observation. And I would be curious to hear the other panelists' views on this. I will raise 1 or 2 other points, and then I will turn it over to the other colleagues. Is the interesting question, again, something that I've observed in my work, and I think the panelists here have deep experiences of their own, is that often, I mean, we were talking about the issue of teacher quality, and this is a real concern in how do we help support, train, retrain, the professional development of our teachers as the demands of the education systems are changing so rapidly that we need this constant infusion of new knowledge and new learning opportunities for our teachers. Those opportunities are often expensive and costly. So, for instance, I have seen models repeatedly, and I'm sure you're all familiar, where there is reliance on international funding, bilateral funding from international actors, or multilateral funding. This raises another interesting question. What happens to the balance of the role of the state in regulating, managing, guiding an education system when there is external funds coming in? And I mean, in the global work, we often talk about the donor funding, right? And then the ways in which it might shape and change the state's agenda, state's approaches. And I think that question deserves some thinking and attention as well, and would be interesting for us to explore. And then maybe I'll make one final comment and then I will turn it over. This is something that I have explored a fair bit in my work with various colleagues, is the ways in which the state often pulls back as if its own regulatory and financial roles to actually make education more accessible. So the example that comes to mind is the example of relying on contract-based teachers. This is something that I've studied a fair bit, and maybe some are familiar with this idea. But providing teachers with a certain degree of education and experience across remote parts of the world, of the country, can often be a big challenge. So many countries, particularly in Africa and in Asia, have relied on this practice of contract-based hiring, where the government itself will say, while we have requirements for what a teacher should be trained in, we will take that requirement away because we can't find all these teachers with this level of training. And we will accept people with less training, less formal education as a teacher, and have them teach in these remote rural locations, but they will also get paid much less than the regular government teachers. So here is an example where often it is a government policy solution where both the regulations are changed, the policies, and also the financial implications are that this government is actually spending less. But the result is that the government is unable to make education accessible in otherwise hard to reach areas. I mean, it's a very complex question, and the literature on contract-based teaching is very complex. I don't mean to simplify the point, but I'm just laying out a few other points for our considerations, in terms of the complex role of the government, the role of the private sector, the role of international finance, and how we think about each of these pieces. So thank you so much, Dr. Ibrahim.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Anita. Actually, it's really a complex issue to understand the relation between state and education, because actually we, as a parents, as a teachers, even as an academics, if we are not focused on specifically the educational policy field, we don't understand what factors behind their minds or in front of their tables waiting for them to decide. So it's very important and how much money we have in the treasury and how kind of actors asking different kind of privilege from the government. So these all make it complex, but all citizens asking the best supply, best service in education. Actually, they deserve that. And even the state's most important role in education to supply all citizens in current world for the migrated people as well, the best educational possibilities, opportunities, and these are all challenging issues in all over the world. And Dr. Fatos,
Yes.
as a sociologist and as a Balkanian, we will listen your last comments.
My last comments will start with a frightening observation. The students I teach at the university are born in the year 2005, 2006. And the age gap between us educators, professors, and students is widening to a frightening degree.
Like it is same for politicians, as I said before.
Well, that's even worse because they make decisions.
Yeah, that's true.
But the plain truth is that today, almost every student uses AI. Lots of teachers do not, meaning the students are well ahead of their teachers, especially in secondary education level. And they have a much better idea of what the future brings to do than we do have. In this situation, if this situation doesn't change, we as educators will miss a unique opportunity indeed to guide students in harnessing the AI potential while teaching them to think critically about its limitation and impacts. This is a challenge that we have never faced before in our human history, never in the past. As educators, in many cases, we must probably abandon our own pre-digital instincts and comfort zones, remembering that we are teaching students born, as I said, in the 21st century, not in the mid-20th century or later on. Well, one might ask, rightfully so, what's the government got to do with it? What is the state's responsibility in all this? And specifically, what role should the state play? So the state's responsibility is large, and the role it can play is immense indeed. Advancing nations' global competitiveness and promoting fair education requires not only substantial investments in education, but also sound state policies that can successfully address these unprecedented issues. Governments engage in shaping education policies everywhere and in playing a significant role in furthering changes within the education system. They provide adequate and equitable funding to improve working conditions for teachers, and it was very rightfully mentioned here, to improve working conditions for teachers and services for school. Governments also support a well-prepared and skilled educators workforce, train students as teachers and students, increase teachers' pay to recognize their value because they're undervalued almost everywhere, invest in their professional development, improving learning opportunities for teachers so that these activities are effective and relevant to their roles, approve credentials for teachers to validate their professional abilities for instruction and intervention in these new times. Government also support and should better support modernized school facilities and infrastructures. Most of the schools are built 50 years ago in our countries, in Albania as well. So new schools are needed for this new era and for this K-12 education and students that are born in this age. Government also need to subsidize, and this is important, broadband delivery in rural areas and improve connectivity in remote areas to ensure that students in remote rural communities who lack access to broadband and high-speed internet can use digital tools just like their peers in urban areas. Government also have the duty to ensure that students with disabilities, and this is very important, as human rights are very important, too can develop digital literacy and in better ways than that used to do in the past. Now, all being said, it is both a moral and a civic duty of every government to guarantee a high quality, free public education that is accessible to all children. And upholding education as a fundamental and universal human rights requires not being left behind and achievements of the fourth industrial revolution, characterized, as we all know, by a convergence of digital, physical, and biological systems involving technologies such as automation, data exchange, cyber physical system, cloud and cognitive computing, etc. But the combined of all this is shaping our future. And this is what we should be looking for. Now, in closing, and I'll be brief, I have three comments to make. First, the reformation of the education system cannot succeed unless it is extended over the entire pyramid system of education. This requires rethinking how knowledge, learning, and education at all levels can address future challenging and opportunities in line with the vision of the International Commission of the Future of Education established by UNESCO in 2019 to look at the education beyond the year 2050. Secondly, it is our historical responsibility as a generation of adults to pass on to the young generation an education system in which they will receive the necessary language. Our colleagues from Lesotho rightly emphasize this, and skills that are needed in the coming decades of the 21st century. In the years 2060, 2070, if we neglect this obligation or do not abide by it, we will not only fail to fulfill our intellectual mission to our society as teachers, but we will also be judged and held accountable by generations to come. For we are accountable for both our acts and our failures to act. As Molière used to say, that it is not only what we do, but also what we don't do for which we are accountable. And lastly, and related to the second one, for the education system and the policies that will affect the education and professional development of the younger generation, the decision-making stays in the hands of the adult generations. It's those politicians that you mentioned that decide, regardless of how wise and well-informed we are, or we may think we are, even those among the most prominent of us. Our responsibility to the education of the young generation can only be fulfilled successfully if we know their skills, their talents, and their wants, and invest accordingly. I think these were the last comments I wanted to make.
It's wonderful. Thank you very much. Very clearly and definite comments and ideas to follow after this panel. I am being in Uganda, I need to share some statistic. They are very current statistic published by the National Statistic Bureau of Uganda to understand how the situation, conditions are different all over the globe. Only 50% of the population have access to the electricity in Uganda. It's an administrative statistic. And only 10% have access to the internet, and only 3.4% of household has computers or laptops. Even when I'm talking with the PhD students or master degree students in here, Makerere University, I'm asking them, do you have access at your home to the internet? Do you have a laptop? Do you have a chance to search online? Mostly they say, yes, if we are in the city, in the town, it's easy. But if you go to the village or the rural areas, it's very difficult. So why I'm talking about those, when we are talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning and technology and digital transformation, digital shift in the world, we also need to look at the all part of the world. Because I'm talking about sub-Saharan. Your Excellency, Dr. Mufana, you know well better than me how the conditions in sub-Saharan Africa. Also, I think mostly similar conditions we have in India, for example. Maybe we have in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in some East Asian countries. And I don't have any idea, but I think in Latin America also we have some very difficult situation in some places. So equity and fair and the sustainability are very important terms actually when we talk and when we think all over the world. And if we talk about only European and Western and developed countries, it's very easy to deal with the challenges, but it is very difficult in other side of the world. Actually, we have 7 minutes to finish our session. I have very personal questions to the former minister honorable guest, Dr. Mofana. If you get again the role of ministry in your country, what is your priority in education and state roles in education? How do you answer this question?
If I understood your question well, you're saying the role of government.
If you get the role of minister in your country,
I see.
what
Okay,
will
okay,
be your
right.
own priority in the government? Yes.
The role of the minister, in Lesotho, ministers are more policymakers than implementers. So you have to listen to say the mandate that your party or your government got into government was because you said you'll have more access made possible for everybody. So as a minister, yours is to ensure that the officials within the department are implementing what you have promised the electorate. So as a minister, yours is to see that what you promised is implemented. So it's a very tricky situation because coming from an academic background and going into a political background, the switch is very difficult. You still have the temptation to go deeper into the actual delivery. But I must say that the relationship between the minister and the school owners, who are churches in this case, is very cordial at the moment, and that makes it easy for things to happen. So let me just conclude by just saying the gentleman from Albania mentioned that the issue of reform has to go through the entire pyramid. I was just talking about education in general. I didn't even touch on higher education, inclusive education, and all the other facets of education because I was looking at the time frame. But the minister is responsible for policy to ensure that the policy that the government entered into office is being fulfilled by the officials. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mofana. Can I ask you the same question, Dr. Anita? If you have a kind of role, what will be your priority for the role of, in terms of role of state in education?
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I am very much an academic, and I don't have the luxury necessarily to be thinking in those terms. I hope my research guides it, but I think I might say that what I have come to observe through my research and observations is the really central role of teachers in a few different ways. So one is, of course, the undeniable importance of teachers for what our children will learn and the future we can prepare them for. It is just beyond doubt that a good education system requires teachers who are prepared to take on the challenges. And I don't believe there is any dispute there. And I don't believe that technology, however successful, is going to entirely, have us do away with the importance of teachers. So having recognized that, the other piece is that teacher salaries are very significant aspect of education budgets, current education expenditure budgets, which makes teachers important also from a policy, just kind of a financial economic perspective. And then the third piece is this piece of teacher constant preparation in the ways in which we might best help and support them, which is a very complex question as well, as much as we would like things to be simple and straightforward. So I find myself thinking a lot these days about questions surrounding policies that are important for the teachers, because I see how it has connections to so many aspects of the success of our education system, from regulation, finance, to ultimately what is best for our children. So that's where my thoughts are these days in response to your question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And the same questions to you, Dr. Fatas. Just I'm asking for about hope and dreams.
Yeah, well, we dream a lot, but what we dream is not always easy to realize. Now, my teaching experience has been at the university level all my life, but I've had the opportunity to check and review textbooks that are used in high schools as well. And having, as I said, two grandkids and looking at the textbooks that are used in school, I think that there's a lot of to desire. I mean, what do we teach students today? Usually teachers teach them what they were taught themselves. There are teachers in high schools and lower levels of schools who never change the textbook because it's easier for them using the same textbook years after years. They don't have to prepare for new knowledge and get that knowledge. If you do not receive new knowledge, you'll not transmit that knowledge to the young generation of kids. And that's a problem. So a minister of education, I'm not in a position to give advice, but will keep in mind that we're living in a very dynamic world, especially in the area of technology. Our knowledge on technology is doubled every other year. So what do we have to teach them? How should the government assist, not only financially, but also investing in teachers' education? That is very important. Not leaving teachers at the same level. Many countries require that teachers today get a master's degree in education or somewhere else, so they could be better prepared to teach, do their job. A few years ago, we passed a law on higher education in Albania, and my concern was that the system should not be reformed from the top level, should be reformed from the preschool level. There were politicians that will say that, in 5 years we'll have the same universities as Europe. Indeed, only when our 5 years kids today will reach the university age, then our school system can change. It doesn't change overnight. It takes time and passion.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much. It's very good time to finish our discussion. Thank you to our esteemed panelists for their insightful contributions, to everyone for actively engaging in today's discussion. We have explored the complexities and diverse aspects of state education relations, from global technological investments to regional nuances, shaped by historical, cultural, and political context. It's clear that the relationship between state and education is dynamic and requires ongoing adaptations, as you said, Dr. Fatos, to meet the evolving needs of society. As we conclude this panel, I encourage all of us to continue reflecting on the key takeaways and how they can inform our work and policy making in the future. The challenges are significant, but so are the opportunities for positive change. Thank you once again for your participation. And I sincerely look forward to further discussions with all of you and collaborations as we work together toward a fairer, more equitable, and more sustainable educational system. Have a good day, all audience and all who engage with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It was a really enjoyable discussion, exchange. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
A very interesting discussion indeed. Thank you so much to our moderator, Professor Karataş, and of course our esteemed panelists for your contributions.